He stepped into his mansion well past midnight, the echo of his shoes bouncing against the polished marble floors, expecting silence, expecting only the faint hum of the chandelier lights and the emptiness that usually greeted him after another long day of business meetings and high-stakes negotiations. Instead, he froze. There was music, soft, rhythmic, pulsing to the corridors like a secret heartbeat. It didn't belong there. It felt out of place in his carefully ordered world. He loosened his tie, his brow furrowed, and followed the sound, every step heavier than the last. The closer he got, the louder it became, until he realized it wasn't just music. There was laughter, too. Not just any laughter. Her laughter. His nurse wife. The woman who had stood by his side during illness, who had nursed him back to health after sleepless nights, who had whispered promises of loyalty and sacrifice. A laugh he hadn't heard in years. Carefree, vibrant, unguarded. It pierced him deeper than any dagger could. He reached the doorway of the private lounge, and there it was, the sight that twisted his heart. His wife, in a simple dress that moved like liquid around her frame, was dancing. Not alone, not in secret meditation, but with a young black girl whose energy filled the room, whose every motion radiated freedom, rebellion, and joy. They twirled together like they had done this before, like this wasn't spontaneous, but something practiced, something nurtured in the shadows of his absence. The billionaire gripped the doorframe, his knuckles white, his chest rising and falling with disbelief. He wanted to storm in, to demand answers, to shatter the illusion, but something held him back. He couldn't look away. He saw the way his wife's eyes lit up, the way her body moved with a grace he hadn't witnessed in years. It wasn't just dancing. It was liberation. And the girl, the stranger, was the source. She wasn't just teaching her steps. She was unlocking something hidden, something that had been buried under years of routine, silence, and unspoken loneliness. The billionaire's mind raced. Who is she? How long has this been happening? Why here in my home, under my roof? He thought about all the nights he'd come home late, too consumed by contracts and markets to notice the hollow silence in her eyes. Now that silence was gone. She was alive in a way she hadn't been with him for years, and it crushed him. The music swelled, the girl spun her with confidence, and his wife's laughter rose again. It was radiant. So radiant that for a brief second he felt like an intruder, like he wasn't her husband but just a stranger peering into a life that no longer included him. His chest tightened, a mix of anger, jealousy, and a haunting sorrow. The empire he had built with billions couldn't compete with his moment of raw, unfiltered freedom. And as he stood there, hidden in the shadows, he realized he wasn't ready to confront them. Not yet. He needed to understand, to know why, to hear from her own lips what this meant. But the longer he watched, the more a dangerous thought crept into his mind. What if she no longer belongs to me? What if the life we built together was nothing more than a cage she's finally broken free from? The thought burned, but he couldn't silence it. And in that moment, as the music carried them both higher, he understood one truth. When the dance stopped, his world would never be the same again. If you've ever laid next to someone who made you feel completely alone, then maybe this story isn't just mine. It's ours. And if that's true, subscribe. Because stories like this deserve to be heard by those who understand. He lingered in the shadows longer than he intended, the billionaire's heartbeat thrumming like a war drum in his chest, each thud echoing the storm of emotions tearing through him. Anger clawed at his throat, demanding to be unleashed, while heartbreak sank heavy into his ribs, suffocating him. His wife had sworn to him that she needed rest, that her nights were consumed with tending to his fragile health and her demanding hospital shifts, that she had no energy left for anything else. And yet here she was, glowing, laughing, twirling like a woman reborn. He could barely recognize her. She wasn't the tired, quiet, reserved nurse he had kissed on the cheek just hours ago. She was radiant, alive, and it wasn't him who made her that way. His hand shook as it hovered near the door handle. He wanted to burst in, to stop the music, to silence the laughter, to demand an explanation that would stitch his unraveling pride back together. But he hesitated. What would he even say? How could he accuse her when he didn't even understand what he was seeing? The girl, young, bold, unapologetically free. spun his wife again, and this time their eyes locked in such a way that the billionaire's stomach turned. There was something deeper than dancing. It was a bond, a secret, an intimacy he wasn't privy to. Every scenario played in his mind. Maybe this girl was a friend. Maybe she was teaching her to find herself again. Maybe he was overreacting. But then came the whispers. His wife leaned close to the girl's ear, saying something he couldn't make out, and they both laughed, their voices mingling with the beat of the song. That laughter, it didn't belong to him anymore. And the truth cut sharper than any betrayal. His billions, his power, his empire, none of it mattered in this moment. He couldn't buy back her smile. He stepped back, his chest rising and falling, tore between charging in and walking away forever. But he knew one thing for certain. This night would not end in silence. The truth was no longer something he could ignore, whether whispered through lips or carved through tears. He would demand it, because nothing, not even the walls of his empire, could shield him from the storm that had already begun inside his home. And as he turned his eyes back toward the glowing room, he knew the confrontation wasn't a question of if. It was a question of when. I don't care about algorithms. I care about the people listening to this who are bleeding silently like I did. If you ever held back tears just to protect someone who didn't protect you, subscribe. You don't have to do this alone anymore. When he finally pushed the door open, the hinges creaked just enough to cut through the music and laughter like a blade through silk. Both women froze mid-step, their eyes snapping toward him. His wife's face drained of color, and for a fleeting second, the billionaire thought he saw a guilt flicker there, like a candle caught in a gust. The young girl, however, didn't flinch. She met his gaze with a defiance so sharp it almost mocked him. That stare told him everything. This wasn't some innocent misunderstanding. Something deeper bound them, and he was the outsider in his own home. His wife rushed forward, her voice trembling as she whispered, "You weren't supposed to be here tonight." She tried to mask her words with a smile, but her lips quivered, her hands twisting nervously as if trying to tie the truth into a knot. He searched her face for answers, for explanations that could glue back together the fragments of trust already slipping through his fingers. Instead, every glance, every hesitation, every half-formed excuse only shattered him further. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice low but carrying the weight of thunder. It wasn't the voice a man used to demanding business deals or commanding boardrooms. It was the voice of a husband fighting to keep his world from collapsing. The silence that followed cut deeper than any words ever could. His wife stammered, but before she could form a lie, the young girl stepped forward fearless, her chin lifted high. "She doesn't have courage to tell you," she said, her voice laced with an unsettling mixture of pity and defiance. "But I will." The room tilted. The air thickened. Every breath felt like betrayal itself crawling into his lungs. He gripped the edge of the doorframe to steady himself, his mind screaming for him to leave, to stop listening, to walk away before the truth tore him apart. But his heart, the foolish, stubborn heart, refused. He needed to hear it, even if it destroyed him, even if it left nothing but ashes where love once lived. In that moment, the empire he built, the fortune he protected, the legacy he had envisioned, it all felt worthless. Because the only treasure that ever mattered, the only wealth he couldn't buy, was slipping away with every beat of her silence and every daring word from the girl who had just stepped into his life like a storm. And as the music faded into a haunting echo in the back of his mind, he realized he wasn't just about to hear an explanation. He was about to face a truth that would redefine everything he thought he knew about his wife and himself. The billionaire's chest tightened as he stood there, waiting for his wife's voice to rise, for her to deny everything, for her to laugh at the absurdity and call it all a misunderstanding. But instead, she lowered her eyes, her lips parted as though she wanted to speak, yet no words came. Her silence was deafening, louder than any accusation. He could feel the betrayal tightening around his throat, like an invisible noose. The young girl's words hung in the air, electric, daring, undeniable. "She hasn't been working those nights," she said, her tone calm, almost rehearsed, as though she prepared for this confrontation. "She's been here with me." The sentence cracked the room open like a lightning bolt splitting the sky. His wife's knees buckled as though the weight of her secret had finally collapsed onto her shoulders. She reached out toward him, her hands trembling, but he instinctively stepped back. The distance between them wasn't just physical. It was a chasm of truth that had just been carved into their marriage. Every detail he had overlooked came rushing back with cruel clarity. The late-night showers, the sudden silences when he entered the room, the way her eyes darted away when he asked simple questions. He thought they were small things, stress from the hospital, the exhaustion of long shifts. But now every excuse, every lie, replayed in his mind like a cruel film. "I can explain," she finally whispered, but her voice cracked under the weight of her own deceit. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, to rip apart every layer of lies she had wrapped around them. But the words refused to leave his mouth. He only stared, his breathing shallow, as if the air itself had turned poisonous. The young girl reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, her thumb gliding across the screen. "Do you want proof?" she asked, her voice cold and sharp, slicing through the fragile silence. His wife gasped, "No, don't," but it was too late. The billionaire's eyes fell on a glowing screen, and the images burned into his vision, photos that left no room for denial. His heart thundered in his ears, each beat echoing betrayal. In that moment, the billionaire realized this wasn't just a breaking of trust. It was a breaking of himself. Everything he believed about love, loyalty, and devotion was unraveling in real time, leaving him exposed, raw, and drowning in disbelief. He could no longer tell whether he was still standing in his own home or whether he had already been exiled into a nightmare. And as his wife's tears fell, mixing with her silence, he understood one terrifying truth. This was only the beginning. The story wasn't over. The unraveling had just begun. If this sounds like your life, stop pretending you're fine. Stop hiding it like I did. Subscribe, not for me, but for every person who thought they were crazy, until the truth finally shattered them. You're safe here. We see you. The phone slipped from his hand and clattered against the marble floor, its screen still glowing with damning evidence. He stared at it as if it had transformed into a weapon that had just pierced through his chest. His wife moved toward him, her face pale, her lips trembling with words she could not form. But he didn't flinch. For the first time in years, he looked at her not as the woman he trusted, not as the nurse who cared for others with compassion, not as a partner he built a life with, but as a stranger who had robbed him of peace. His pulse pounded in his ears. The room felt both suffocating and infinite, like walls closing in while the ground fell away beneath him. He had built empires, moved markets, survived ruthless boardrooms and the betrayals of men who wore masks of friendship. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for betrayal that now stood weeping in front of him. This wasn't just money lost or a deal broken. This was his soul being dismantled piece by piece. She whispered. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Her words trailed off into sobs, but to him, they sounded hollow, rehearsed, like lines spoken in a play where she had already chosen her role long before this moment. The young girl remained silent now, her phone clutched tightly, her eyes cold and steady, as if daring him confront the reality that had just been forced upon him. The billionaire's throat tightened. He wanted to scream, to demand, to force her to tell him why. Why risk everything? Why betray the life they had built? Why take vows that meant nothing? But all that came out was silence. A silence so heavy it weighed down the room more than any words could. Every moment of their life together flashed before him like cruel photographs. The wedding vows spoken under golden lights, the long nights he held her after exhausting shifts, the vacations where she smiled under foreign skies, promising forever. But now, those memories were poisoned. Every kiss felt counterfeit, every touch a rehearsed lie, every smile a mask that hid a secret life. And in that silence, he felt something shift deep within him. It was the slow cracking of the foundation he had stood on for years, the beginning of a collapse he could neither stop nor control. Trust was gone. Love was broken. What remained was a man standing in the ruins of his marriage, unsure if he could ever rebuild from the ashes. His wife sobbed harder now, reaching for him, whispering, "Please, let me explain, let me make this right." But he stepped back again, the distance between them growing with every second. Her pleas sounded desperate, but to him, there were echoes in a cavern of betrayal. Too late, too hollow, too broken. And as he turned his gaze once more toward the incriminating photos on the floor, he knew one truth with terrifying clarity. The life he thought he was over. What came next would not be about saving what was lost. It would be about surviving what had been destroyed, that you've come this far. That means something. You felt this. You lived it. Maybe not this exact story, but your own version of it. So if you're still here, still breathing under the weight of something they'll never apologize for, hit subscribe. Because no one should walk through this kind of betrayal alone. And if no one else says it, I will. I'm glad you're still here.